Welcome to the in-between,
where shift happens,
the moment between where we are
and where we are going.
We will ask all the questions,
maybe find some answers,
and generally work at being okay.
In the mystery of the in-between.
This episode, we are going to ask the question, who is my neighbor? So if you don't know if you're new to the podcast, you don't know the stick to this, we come with an agreed upon topic ish, and the other person poses some questions that the other person doesn't know the questions, and so it just really allows us to kind of be raw in the moment in this conversation. And I have been reading a lot and listening to a lot of audiobooks, and whenever that happens, then I just kind of get all in my feels and all the questions start swirling in my brain. And so this question kind of came up, who is my neighbor? I think, I think most of us are familiar, at least in a Judeo-Christian sort of understanding of, love your neighbor as yourself, right? And then who is our neighbor? What is our neighbor, right? I don't know that it's just limited to people. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to explore this question, especially in the context of sometimes we forget that, and it's very easy now, especially we can look out in the world and see that we're not being very good neighbors. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. And so I figured let's just explore this. Are you ready? You ready to kind of
ready as I'm gonna be. Here we go.
I mean, I don't know if there's any right and wrong, but just to be interesting to see the insight. So I guess I'll just start off with a question. Like when you think about the verbiage, love your neighbor or who is your neighbor? Like what comes up for you? Who is your neighbor, Dan?
Yeah. I'm not going to lie. The very first thing that comes to mind is Mr. Rogers.
Ah.
And kind of in a fun, jovial manner. But also, I mean, I think kind of growing up watching that, like that was legit.
Oh yeah, for real.
I mean, he was really cutting edge for his time and probably cutting edge for now. But I think, for me, I think about the neighbors I had growing up, and I don't mean this in a well, back then kind of way, but like we had a neighborhood. I mean, we grew up knowing our neighbors. We knew the people on the block, and we were all friendly, and there was kids around, and we'd all go out and play after school and whatever. And it was not the block I grew up on was not like a homogenous block either. I mean, it was fairly diverse. And yet at the same time, it was also still very like 1980s, 1990s, where like what happened in the house stayed in the house kind of thing. And so as much as we were around our neighbors, I didn't really know a whole lot about my neighbors, and something happened. I don't know, something changed. Like by the time I graduated high school, like neighbors didn't really talk or interact much, so I don't know. I mean, like something, it feels like something switched where being a neighbor meant something very different by the time I became an adult than it did when I was growing up. And now, I mean, I look around my block and like I am familiar with my neighbors, but I don't know that I really know my neighbors really.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that might be, I mean, living in an apartment, the apartment below us, we've had, 3 or 4 different families living down there since we've been here. So there is more turnover than the suburbs that I grew up in where a family owned the house,
Right.
But I think, to know my neighbors feels like a really different experience than the one that I'm actually having. And I wonder if that's common. Like, how many of us really know our neighbors? Like, who are you living around?
Right. Well, and I think when I think about, and even this question, just to kind of take it like a little bit like more expansive, like when I thought about who is my neighbor, it wasn't like who was living around me. That was not even like the
Yeah.
first thought. It was this idea for me that everyone and everything is our neighbor, because if you think about kind of the concrete understanding of neighbors, like the thing that you live in or you live around, right?
Yeah.
And we're in this on this earth around people and around
Yeah.
nature and around all the things. And you also there's this idea of when you have a neighbor, there's this idea of mutual support. I mean, it kind of for me it brings that feeling. And so for me, like how what came up for me is like how can we be like neighbors to one another in that sense, right? How can
Yeah.
we support
Yeah.
one another? Not just the people in our like geographic area. I think that's a very kind of limited understanding of neighbor. And I think if we like expand that, like how can we be in service to each other
Yeah.
and to like our plant neighbors and our animal neighbors and our like earth as a right. And so
Yeah.
it's this really kind of like, I think for me, it was like this zoomed out view,
Hmm.
a neighborhood, right? Because I think
Yeah.
that's what
Yeah.
it's like what is the microcosm of the macrocosm? And like, am I being a good neighbor, right? Not only in my immediate environment, but beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
And I think too, what do you think? Well, I'll ask what you think first, and then I'll ask you. What do you think? What do you think gets in the way of what knowing our neighbors in that kind of very like micro sense, like what you're talking about, and then knowing our neighbor in this macro sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do
Yeah.
you think gets in the way of that?
Um, I think there's probably a lot of stuff that gets in the way. I mean, one of the big things I think is like the connection that we have through the internet. I think gives us some sort of like it's great. I mean, I really can appreciate the kind of connection that happens because of the internet, because of social media. And at the same time, I think it also gives us like a sort of false sense of connection
Mm,
because it allows us to kind of remain like in our own like little world in our own little bubble where we don't have to kind of step outside and look around and see like who am I actually being a neighbor to, you know? Um yeah, I don't know. So I don't know that social media is like I hesitate to say, well, social media is getting in the way, but I think the mentality that comes along with that, like over importance on individualism, right? Individualism is great and really important. But when it becomes overly important, when we only want the world to see the Instagram perfect photo or the Instagram perfect version of our life and not like our actual lived life, I think that's really easy to do when we put it up online. We only put up the edited version and we're not putting up the raw, authentic version. I think that's, it's kind of like keeping everything at just enough of an arm's distance to not really let in the neighbor,
yeah.
your actual, I don't know. I mean, everyone in some sense is your neighbor, but um, kind of that same thing, like what happens in the house stays in the house, like grew up, quote, close to our neighbors. And yet I don't really feel like I knew them as people. I knew my friends as friends, but like, I don't know how much, the adults really knew each other. I don't think I didn't really know the adults, you know? Um, I think it's kind of that same thing. It's like
Mm,
this cultural aversion to like really letting people in, you know? Um, I think that probably plays a big part in it. I think I don't know, we should just have like a checklist of like, well, rugged individual, capitalism, I mean, Isn't it kind of the same things that come up all the time?
It's like a bingo card.
Yeah, seriously. But I mean, I think it is, right? I mean, I think the interplay between rugged individualism, the American dream, and capitalism, once again, they kind of showing their heads here of like, yeah, I mean, I think rugged individualism plays a whole lot into the overimportance of individualism and pulls us away from collaboration and connectivity.
Mhm.
I think capitalism and the American dream, like if you put your blinders on, put your head down and do your work, if you work hard enough, you'll get the thing and then you'll have everything. You'll have made it. You'll have what you need,
Right.
which really ain't how it works. I mean, I think we've found that loud and clear at this point. Like that doesn't get you what it promises. If what it promises is even possible, it certainly isn't possible on your own. If it is possible, it's coming through connection to others. And if it's not possible, whatever solution or alternative there is certainly is through connection with others, certainly is through recognizing the interconnectedness of us all, and realizing we really are like global neighbors,
Mhm.
worldly neighbors, right? Like it is recognizing our connection to the land that maybe we've always, as a whole, have always looked at as a resource that is expendable, when really it's not. It's the thing we're living in. You know, it looks at people. We look at people as humans, not as worker bees that make the thing or work the place or whatever. So I think that the interconnectivity is kind of the alternative to I don't know, whatever it is that really is standing in the way. I think connectivity is probably the thing, is probably the answer. you know
Well, and I think too, I think that we're just not curious enough, because I think
yeah,
that being open to curiosity is what allows us to,
yeah,
um, be open to the perspectives and life experiences of others. I think, historically, I think this is just human nature. We like to kind of gather with people that we can relate to, or people that
yeah,
we think understand us, or people that have the same experience as us, or believe like us, or look like, right? You see
yeah,
that a lot in how
yeah,
people choose where they live and things like that. But I think that in order for us to really, I think, grasp this idea of who our neighbor is, which is everyone. I mean, that's the answer, everyone, in case you're waiting for the answer. Everyone's our neighbor. Everything is our neighbor.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but for us to actually know that on a deeper level, whether it's our animal neighbors, or, the neighbors in nature, or whether it's the people across the street, or people across the city, or, whatever, I think that we've gotten out of the habit of being really curious and awe-inspired, or standing in the mystery of things, and I think that really impacts our ability to know our neighbor, to see our neighbor, to get curious about, um, people's life experiences and what we can learn from them, what others can learn from our own, right? It keeps us from, seeing and being seen, and so
yeah, yeah,
I think infusing a little bit more curiosity in our lives about those things,
yeah.
I think enhances our ability to be.
I wonder too, the more that we are exposed to all the different variety of life, I think the more potential there is for it to be scary or seem scary.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder if if our innate need for safety has a big role to play in keeping us feeling separate from our neighbor, right? Like we're looking
Yeah.
for, our brain wants a definitive answer on things most of the time. Like it thrives off of clarity. It's just not like ambiguous answers. And so I think it's easy in that, right, to kind of come up with like, oh, well, these people are this way and these people are this way. We do things the right way and they do it the wrong way, or we're right and everyone else is wrong. And so we kind of look for that in group that's
Yeah.
doing it, quote, the right way, however, whatever we think is the right way. So I think our brains are like not wired for the amount of information that's coming at us.
Oh, not even close, right? Not even
Yeah.
close. Just
Um,
overwhelmed.
so I wonder how much of that overwhelm kind of puts into overdrive
Mm.
that need for safety, and how easy it becomes then to like kind of double down on A and B answers, right and wrong kind of
Yeah.
things. I bet that probably has a big part to play in dividing us from our neighbors.
Yeah, and I think it's this idea that we're always right, like my way is the right way. I mean, we see
Yeah.
that now. It's like it's really interesting when we look at, our social landscape, our political landscape, and if we can really take a step back from all the stuff, right? The infighting and all the things. It's like we all want the same thing. Like at the base level, we all want and need the same things. And it's really interesting how we have how we forget that,
Mm,
and how it's so easy to use dehumanizing language. And
yeah.
once we do that, right, we when we dehumanize someone through our language or our actions, then it's easier to continue to oppress and continue to not be curious and
Yep.
continue whatever. And it's like this really interesting idea that in order for me to be safe, I have to dehumanize you, right?
Right. Right.
And if we could just understand, like step back from that and realize, wow, this person just wants the same thing that I want. And how they're getting to it's different, or how they see the way to it is different. But I wonder, um, what would be possible if we could understand that at the base level?
Yeah.
And I think that's a question we ask all the time. And I mean, there's it feels like the answer is so science fiction, right? It's so like
Yeah.
one of
Really.
those
Yeah.
futuristic novels, but I think it is that understanding. And I think a lot of it's out of fear. Just like the same thing about really not knowing our neighbor, kind of staying safe, kind of staying in our own closed bubble
Yeah.
of belief and people that are like us, or look like us, or think like us.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think it does take it's interesting from that bubble to like more expansive. There's like a space, and it feels like it's a empty chasm that you step over and you're not sure what's going to happen.
Yeah. It's funny. I was kind of just thinking something really similar to that. Like, there does seem to be this, at least for me, even as we're talking about it, there's like this sense of overwhelm of like, there's so much, there's so much space in between. There's so much going on. There are so many things to care about. It's like, how can I possibly, like, I feel like I need to care about all of the things,
Yeah.
and I
Well,
just
what's the space? Like, I guess that's my question too, like, that space, like, what is it that I don't think it's one thing, but, like,
yeah,
what can really fill that space so that between our bubble and, like, a more expansive view of our neighbor,
yeah,
living that, like, what is the thing? What is the or one of the bridges in that?
yeah. I,
I
I
mean, if you can
mean,
answer that, then, I mean,
well, so this actually came up yesterday, not directly in this context, but a perfect example of this. A couple games of pickleball out at the park, and it's just this random group of mostly guys that get together, and kind of just play, and each other as pickleball players, and you kind of start to get to know each other personally. But rarely is there like deep conversation happening, which is fine. We're out there and everyone's just there to play pickleball. And it's cool to see all these people from all these different backgrounds get together and just exist in a space. And it's like, all right, cool. Um, well, we are filming this on the day of the presidential election. And so when this conversation happened yesterday was the day right before the election. And so as we're all kind of packing up, one of the guys starts uh, took a very particular stance on the election and assumed that everyone else did as well.
Mm.
And it got kind of heated at first, but then settled down, and there actually was some conversation. There was some room for conversation, I think, because we did have that. We all knew each other
Right.
and knew we got along and knew we liked each other.
Like that foundation.
Yeah,
Like
so
that.
we had that foundation prior to having this conversation. But it was fascinating to see that there was an assumption, because I think because we all got along and knew each other and knew we liked each other, that there was an assumption from this guy that, oh, well, we all must then think the same way and hold the same political beliefs and whatever. But what started to really come up in the conversation was that the life experiences, especially those growing up, were so very different and seemingly isolated. I mean, this guy basically shared, like, the way I see the world now is so different from the world that I grew up in, and it's scary.
Mm.
And, it kind of said, like, a family was one thing growing up,
Mm.
and all the things now, that's not it, and that doesn't seem right to me. And, you know, school was one way, and what got taught in school was this, and this is how it was. And it was very like the way he grew up was the right thing. And like, I totally get that. Like, I
Yeah.
totally
I
get
mean, like
how
you
what we
live one
grew up
way.
with,
Yeah.
what is comfortable, what is quote normal,
Yeah.
is the way we tend to see the world. And so when the world all of a sudden seems to look very different from that, that safety mechanism really kicks in our brain, and it's like, nope, 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 that's wrong.
Warning, warning.
Yeah, danger, danger. uh but it also became pretty apparent, like, the different, I think those of us exposed to the widest life, the widest experience of life,
Mm.
had a tendency to have a much more open perspective on things.
Well, probably more resilient to like the fluidity of life when you have lots of different experiences
Yeah,
instead of one experience. Yeah.
yeah. So I think for me, a large part of that space in between is just being willing to look at and experience the many ways that life shows up,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of that is also like, what are you exposed to as a kid? I mean, if you're only exposed to like a very homogenized way of being, and that's what you grew up with, that's going to seem quote right. That's going to be normal, whatever normal is, right?
Or
Like, that's going to,
familiar. I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So it's like almost like, sometimes things don't have to be right, but if they're familiar, then you gravitate toward the familiar, not
yeah,
whether it's comfortable or not, right?
right, right, yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm sure there's much more to whatever that space is, but but I think that probably has a large part to play, a large amount to do with whatever that space is and why it exists, and also how to kind of bridge that space is like, uh, expose ourselves to all that life has to offer, without trying to make it wrong and judge it as best as possible. Um, and recognize, I think too, like, the parts of life that seem scary. Yes, there are definitely things in life that are threatening, and we
Mhm.
should be aware of that, and act accordingly. Keep ourselves safe from things that are actually threatening. And that there is a difference between life-threatening situations and life situations that feel threatening because it's different from what we're used to.
Yeah.
So I think honing that skill of kind of recognizing the difference between what is actually life threatening and what feels scary, what feels threatening, Not that that's easy,
No.
and not that it's not nothing close to being the same for everybody. I mean, I think that really is pretty personal experience based on the life you lived, and I think the more we can start to recognize, like, oh, maybe this isn't really threatening, even though it feels scary.
Mm.
We can kind of step into that, even just a little bit, right? Just
Yeah.
like inch forward, you know.
I read something the other day and, speaking into like, a spiritual context of this author was talking about like the same thing we're talking about, like people that maybe we disagree with or people that we don't even know, right? I mean, but we're afraid to kind of get to know because we're not really sure. Um, and especially in this idea of like us and them and dehumanizing people. This author posed the question that he tries to do and that really reminds him. We talk about that, this idea that we're all neighbors, we're all living in this
Mm.
kind of this global um neighborhood, and the thing that is back is that like there's one thing, right? There's one thing that is moving all of this, whatever you want to call that. But he talked about how he can begin to kind of bridge that gap and said he thinks that he asked this question. Hopefully I'll get this question right, or I'm going to paraphrase it. Um, he tries to get really curious about what it feels like for the divine to be expressing itself as that person. Like,
Mm.
what must the divine or that one thing feel like expressing itself through that person? And what is the experience of the divine in that
Mm.
expression? If
Yeah.
we believe that we are all um, like this individualized expressions and, um, that we are connected to something, uh, and there's something that connects all of us, regardless of what that something is. Like, we can believe that about ourselves, but we also have to believe about everyone else too. You can't
Right.
it's either
All of us or none of us.
all of us or none of us, and so, it was just a really interesting of like, "Oh, I wonder, um, what it
Mm.
feels like, what the divine feels like expressing as that person, like, what is the thing?" Right?
Yeah.
And we know that thing to be, like, good in the sense of always moving us forward to something, to the next thing, right? So it's not
Yeah.
like that experience would be like what we would perceive as negative. So it was very interesting. It really kind of messed with my brain,
Mm.
but it really kind of spurred like my desire to kind of have some of this conversation, or maybe just to process to process out loud
Yeah.
in this podcast. Like, oh wow, what would I mean? How would our world shift if we even just asked that one question?
Yeah.
Like, wow, what is the experience of the divine expressing it as that person?
Yeah. Well, it makes me think too. There's some like innate call to have reverence for that which is around us, like the
Mhm.
the responsibility that we have to the world around us, and
Yeah,
it also feels greater than just people. And I think you were hinting at this before. Is like our neighbors are not just the people. It's not just. I mean, it's pets, it's trees, it's like the world that we live
right.
as a part of, right? And kind of taking ourselves as humans off the pedestal that we are like top of the, I don't know,
The
evolutionary food
dominion
chain.
of all.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah,
Like the world is not our dominion. We are a part
yes,
of it, and
yes.
we need to have reverence for it, whether it's like not littering
No.
or, I don't know. I mean, just being reverent for like not cutting down all the forests.
Right, or not having
To
that colonizer mindset that everything has to change except for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's all here,
And
right? It's not all here for our, I don't know.
there's
Uh,
a reciprocal nature to our
yeah,
existence.
yeah.
I'm listening to Braiding Sweetgrass,
Mm,
um,
yeah,
and just this beautiful, talking about, indigenous people and the relationship. to the world around us,
Yeah.
and just really enjoying that perspective. Um, and how can we begin to honor that again? And I
Mhm.
think how can we not only love our neighbor, but honor our neighbor, like in
Right,
all of
right.
the senses, right?
Yeah,
And really begin to understand the reciprocal nature of our relationships
yeah,
to one another and to like the world around us. Hmm. Everything is our neighbor.
yeah.
That is the answer to the question. And so I don't
Whatever
know.
the
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for like that. I see people really stepping into this. I see people
Yeah,
stepping into,
yeah,
and I think maybe I've seen it in a real way, having, currently living in a place affected by um, a natural disaster.
sure.
You
Yeah.
see you see that natural impulse of neighbor, that
Mm,
natural impulse
yeah,
of community, that natural without a thought coming together and sharing resources or assisting other folks in getting resources. And so I think it's just taking those opportunities other than like disasters and challenging things to really step back and like it is our nature to do that. It is
yeah,
our nature to lean into that. And how can we begin to do that just on a daily basis and practice that?
yeah, yeah. Hmm.
It's good stuff, my friend. So one takeaway, if you got one takeaway from the conversation, what is it?
One takeaway. I think it's that it's really easy for life to seem like it is one way, or
Mm,
that we even have a clue about how we think life is.
yeah.
Um, Even if life has always seemed to show up that one way for us, that it may not be true.
Mm.
It may not be the way it is.
Yeah, that's a hard realization too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, or it's not the way it is all the time, or for
Mm.
everyone, or all over the place, or in every situation, right? Like I think it's really easy to put the blinders on and see it this way, and I'm going to get stuck in my groove. Like, this is the way it is,
Yeah.
and maybe it's not.
I love that. I think my takeaway is just going back to that curiosity. I think when I get stuck in my own little bubble or blinders on, it's because I'm not curious anymore. I'm like, I
Yeah.
don't care. This is the way it's going to be, and this is the way
Yeah.
it is, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so I think for me, I think it's a little bit of what you're saying too, right? Is just leaning into that curiosity, asking those questions, asking, um, and looking for those opportunities to know my neighbor
Yeah.
in all of the senses, and also to be known by
Yeah.
my
Well,
neighbors
yeah.
in all the senses, right? I think that's the biggest takeaway.
Yeah. Mm,
I love this conversation. Juicy,
good stuff.
juicy, and I'm hopeful that we can all go today and learn a little bit more about our neighbor, whatever that is in our own little sphere.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. Thank you for being part of this conversation. We know this conversation is not the be all end all, and it doesn't end here, but it goes as we go. And so we invite you to go and get to know your neighbor. And then we'll catch you next time here in the in between where a little shift happens.
Nobody really enjoys being in the in between.
But thanks for being here anyway.
We may not have found all the answers,
But certainly some. And maybe more importantly,
a little shift has happened.
and the beauty of it all is that we are not alone in the in-between.
So until next time, we hope a lot of shift happens.